Shukriya Barakzai is a member of parliament in Afghanistan. She grew up in a pre-Taliban Afghanistan playing volleyball, hockey, enjoying a perfectly ordinary childhood. When the Taliban came to power, many of the elite of Afghanistan migrated, but Shukriya and her family stayed back. In 1999, she was flogged on the streets by the Taliban for going to a hospital without a male escort. Instead of succumbing, Shukriya fought back. She started a web of underground schools for children and a medical aid center, which was perhaps in that region the only medical aid center that women could go to. Subsequently, Shukriya stood for elections, fought a very male election, and she speaks of the Afghanistan parliament as a house of lords, warlords, crime lords, and drug lords. We've been featuring Shukriya as somebody that both the Taliban and the NATO fears, and today I hope you're going to get a taste of why that is so.
Thank you.
We had featured Willie as a writer from UK. He called me and he said, "Can you please call me an Indian?" So let me introduce Willie as a surrogate Indian.
The email was headlined, "Wannabe Desi."
That's true. We all know Willie, we all know the wonderful books he's written, but today I'm going to introduce him only in the context of Afghanistan. Willie's new book, which is not yet in the market, is called The Return of the King, and it's about the first Anglo-Afghan war in 1942. And
1839.
1839. What am I saying? I'm so sorry.
Not to be confused with Pearl Harbor, which...
You can see my wiring from yesterday is not fully back on. The interesting thing about Willie's book is that, in a way, it pre-shadows exactly what is happening now, and that's a strand that we're going to follow in our conversation. And I also have Chris Dickey, who we've introduced before as the Paris bureau chief of Newsweek, someone who writes about conflict and terrorism, and someone who firmly believes that the US or any nation in the world has no business occupying another. So thank you very much. Shukriya, let me start with you. You know, when we were talking on the phone before you came to India, the one thing we discussed was that nobody ever asks how Afghanistan sees itself and what does it want for itself. So right up before we discuss all the other complex things, could you give us a sense of what you're looking for in Afghanistan?
Sure. First of all, thank you very much for the opportunity that you met, particularly the THiNK. Let me tell you one thing. Afghanistan is not the country that today you know about it. We've been an empire in early 18s. And whenever I'm thinking about Afghanistan 1919, I was a king. I wish you will have the chance to go and search on the internet and see the nation and the first country which has taken the region their own liberty and freedom from the British colony. But what's happened? Why we are the only country and nation that we don't have step forward? By decades, we had step back, and step back. And today, everybody believes that Afghanistan is one of the poorest countries in the world, the country which is just coming picture with the violence, the country which is, they believe there's a lack of human rights particular, and it's all terror and terrorists. But that's not the clear picture. I love and I'm proud about what we was 5,000 years back from today. The country which is provide the nation, which has met revolutions in the region. The Silk Road, and we have the Buddhas, we have lots of good and real examples, which is nobody can take it from us. But what we are today, it's maybe because of geostrategic position that we got it, but at the meantime, the only nation which is we sacrifice our life for others, particularly during the Cold Wars, that was Afghanistan. 2 million people lost their life, 7 million people was refugees in other countries, including my family, 500,000 widows, and that's the consequence. Why? Because we pay our life, our interest for someone else. But what is today Afghanistan? I don't want my child to have the same life as I had. I'm almost near 39, but I never remember a day, which is when I was a child, I asked my mom, "Mom, when will be security?" And she was always telling me, "One day, dear." I didn't see that day. But I love my kids. They see, they feel, they spend their life in a peaceful, secure, proud Afghanistan. That's what I aim. What is today's situation? Today, everybody wants to judge from their own interest. But no. The generation which is there on the way, they are educated, they're great, they're energetic, they are thinking different. They are trying to being their own selves. But what we are facing, it's not only Afghan problem, it's a global problem. We are a millionaire, but we are begging on the street penny. The trillions, million natural resources we had, it's bring everyone to pay attention. The geostrategic position that I told you, because we can be a good bridge between Central Asia and South Asia and all Asian countries. And that cannot be anymore an excuse. Whatever is today Afghanistan, I'm sure you may know lots of things about Afghan women's, particularly their life. No doubt we are a victim, I'm a victim, but I will never step back. I will never give up. I will go and I will follow my way for equity, for real democracy. I'm not American-made democracy for Afghanistan. As you mentioned, I worked during the Taliban against their regime as educated women. I run a school for the girls. I try my best to do whatever I can on my own capacity. But if you think there's only one Shukriya Barakzai in Afghanistan doing that, no. There's millions. Millions of your sisters, very far away from here, they are struggling, they are fighting every single day to stand on their feet and to be a country which is the region one day will be proud of them.
I just wanted to add that this is a personal detail about Shukriya's life, but she was okay with us sharing it, is that her husband took a second wife without her knowledge.
Yeah.
And that was another thing that Shukriya refused to succumb to. She has in fact got a women's organization. She runs a magazine for women and is a journalist in her own right, where she's constantly fighting for women's rights in Afghanistan.
Yeah. Let me add one sentence. It's very difficult between practice and theory. At that time, I was drafting the constitution for my country for equal rights for men and women. And exactly for 1 year, I had struggled to have that values to be saved for Afghan women. But exactly in the same time, this happened to me. But it doesn't mean I'm weak. It means I'm strong enough, because true to that case, I try my best to stop polygamy. Although it's a dream, but I'm sure one day the dream comes true.
Willie, Afghanistan has never been conquered. We know that President Obama ordered a surge in the troops, and now he's really looking for the tide to go back. Can you just run us through your book and the first Afghan war, which I skipped a century because it really doesn't matter. The situation is the same, In your book, I was reading something that you've written, that there was just one man that came out of that war, and his name was Thomas Suter. And quite allegorically, one of the main NATO bases is called Camp Suter. So could you just tell us, and what is it about the Afghan gene that just refuses to be conquered?
So in the 1830s, you have Britain moving up India, taking hold of Mughal Delhi, and beginning to get anxious about Russia moving down through the Caucasus at exactly the same speed. And it's clear that at some point they're going to converge on Afghanistan. And this is the beginning of the Great Game, which goes on for another century until both the Russian and the British empires collapse. And the British decide to try and preempt the Russians. And a series of 19th century equivalents to the neocons distort intelligence. Again, it's sort of very familiar stuff. Distort a stray single Russian envoy in Kabul and magnify that into the weapon of mass destruction of the 19th century. This becomes the cause of war. And this one envoy is meant to be the precursor of an entire Russian invasion of Afghanistan, which we now know from the Russian archives was never even mooted in a single meeting, never mind actually planned. And so on the basis of this imaginary invasion, a group of hawkish advisors around the very naive new Governor-General encourage him to go to war. And it's a kind of crazy, but even by the kind of any imperial standards, it's a crazy undertaking because Afghanistan doesn't border any British territories. There's the whole of Sindh, which is independent, and there's the whole of Ranjit Singh's Punjab, which is independent in between the two. But still, they march this army with thousands of camp followers. The army is almost entirely Indian. It's upper caste Hindus from Bihar, from Lucknow, who are marched up into Afghanistan. And as with the current war, it's a relatively easy conquest. But as with the current war, there's a beginning of a rebellion in the south, around Helmand. It spreads north, and it's led, you won't be surprised to hear, by Shukriya's ancestors, the Barakzais, who are and if you go to Afghanistan today, the diplomatic area of Kabul is named after Wazir Akbar Khan, her ancestor, who is like Chanakya Puri of Kabul. And you won't be surprised to hear also how formidable her ancestors were and succeeded in utterly destroying the entire British and Indian army, so that Suta, who you mentioned, lived and was captured and became a prisoner. But the more famous image, I think, is Dr. Brydon, who survived 18,000 soldiers retreated from Kabul on the 6th of January, 1841. 6 days later, one man rode into Jalalabad, Dr. Brydon. And he only survived because he had a rolled-up copy of Blackwood's magazine, which was the Tehelka of its day, rolled up in his hat. And when they struck him, I imagine it was a thicker thing than a normal. It was a kind of special issue of Tehelka, and it held the sword blow, and he survived. And I did the journey again last year with, I don't know whether you know Anwar Khan Jagdalik, who's the kind of former Afghan wrestling champion and Mujahideen commander, who's a mountain of a man with cauliflower ears. He looks half the size of the Pamirs himself. And he took me there. And we followed the route. And what was extraordinary was that these names had long forgotten in both India and in Britain. Burns, McNaughton, the people who led the invasion. Every villager on the route knew the names of these people. And the epic, it's like the details were confused. The first and second Afghan wars got slightly muddled up, who was who. But the names, Burns, McNaughton, what had happened to them, and the fact that all the women had been captured and they were now the grannies of a lot of the people in the village, it was remembered. And they said to me, we will do this to all invaders. We kicked you people in the teeth. Now we're kicking the Americans. Next it will be the Chinese.
Exactly. There's a fascinating parallel in India that the tribals of India, in fact, have never been conquered either. And the British actually allowed them to live as autonomous districts because even during the British Raj, many of the tribal communities in India were never subsumed.
We think of ourselves in the same way.
So we have lessons to learn as well about the tribal populations in India. Chris, I wanted to come to you and ask you about the big question about Afghanistan that everyone's asking now, which is the Taliban. What is the way forward? Do you think that talking to the Taliban, and actually that's a question I'm going to ask Shukriya, being on the key player in that, but from a policy perspective and from a foreign policy perspective, what is the way out? Does it make sense to speak to the Taliban, let them come back, and let an indigenous sort of chemistry take over, in the country?
I think it makes sense to realize the United States really can't control that question at all. I think that the Americans have to understand that what they need to do is get out, not think about whether, we're going to get out when the Taliban talk to us. We're going to get out when Kandahar is secure. We're going to get out when we can trust Karzai. Oh, we can't trust Karzai. Ah, he's a wonderful sign of democracy. Who knows? The Americans have no idea what they are doing in Afghanistan. The American people have no idea, and frankly, the American government has no idea. You just had an American general fired this week. Why? Because he gets over to Afghanistan, he looks at the situation, he says, these people are not grateful enough. We're giving them billions of dollars, and they don't like us. This is so unfair. And that kind of thinking is pervasive in the policy toward Afghanistan and indeed toward Iraq as well, because the Americans did not know what they were getting into, and they have not understood what the whole process of occupation is about. Americans have no idea what an occupation is like. Americans never been occupied, and they never admit that they are occupiers. So at the end of the day, they can't understand that when you occupy another country, people do not thank you, and generally speaking, they hate you.
Shukriya, one of the triumphs that the American government would count is that at least they led to the fall of the Taliban. So when you look at this last decade, of course the Taliban is back at the borders of Kabul, but were you at all grateful when the Taliban fell? And let's, as a kind of leap of imagination, imagine that if this invasion of America and the NATO forces had never happened, what do you think would have been the graph of Afghanistan?
Okay, answering before you, I just want to say Afghanistan and Afghans are not for sale. That we should say thank you for the monies that US give us. Never. We will not selling our soil, we will not selling ourselves, we will not selling our country. But for the aid, our door is open, because we paid one day. Maybe back. About thinking of Taliban, first of all, the question is coming, who is Taliban? I don't believe they are anymore a very well organizing political, ideological group. Because I am in the grass, I have contact with them. With them, I mean different groups. They are not the one that they will have the power and to control back the country. Right now, Afghanistan is the playground for the region countries. India, China, Iran, Pakistan, United States, Britain, Russia. It's like all of them like to have a little bit space for themselves and for their own interest. And that's why they like to be somehow engaged what's going on. And soon, early December, there will be an international conference in Bonn, second Bonn. But what is exactly the mindset of Afghans? Learning from the history, none of the empire can take place in Afghanistan to control. Afghanistan is the country to easy take, but not easy control it. It's never been controlled by anyone except Afghans themselves. That's why we always had war and fight.
And even Afghans themselves have only controlled it centrally for very brief moments of history. The Iron Emir, but if you look at the diffraction, isn't there the phrase, an Afghan Emir sleeps on an ant heap?
Yeah, this is something different. This is every single country is not leading by families more than 30, 40 years, but we had families which is they lead the country for a half of century. But for the Taliban coming back, I can't believe they will be back one day in Afghanistan and they will take power. As long as Pakistan will not bring a very extremely high level role on it. Because how you can imagine, Taliban means a person which is going and studying religious study, which is although those things which is they are doing, it's not part of Islam at all. But they don't know how to use the weapon. They don't know how to use the heavy machinery and weapons and stuff like that, and guns. But as long as they have Pakistan support. But I think today the situation in Pakistan is not very pleasant for them themselves. They are also extremely in a very fragile situation. Today or tomorrow, if another attack will happen in Afghanistan under the name of Taliban, they will be not anymore. Allow me to say that if there's any Afghan wants to contribute to the government through to the very democratic process with the name of election, we will most welcome them. Democracy means pluralism. Democracy means everybody is allowed to say what they like, but under rule of law, respecting, accepting, and implementing the Afghan constitution, and trying their best to support on the best way the country for a better future. But if we believe that the ideology of Taliban will come one day back, no. That ideology at the beginning was not made in Afghanistan. That ideology was out of the Afghanistan. And that ideology will never control back Afghanistan. Today, 2011 Afghanistan is much different than 1996. 1996 and 1995, they came and take because people was tired from civil war. But if today they want to come, I will stand against them in a very armed way, and I will stop them first. When I say I, the women of Afghanistan, because we suffered more than anyone.
I would like to be in Mullah Omar's shoes at this moment.
Chris, I'm going to ask you about Hillary Clinton's definition of good terrorists and bad terrorists. But before I come to that, Shukriya, you're also the chairman of the Defense Committee.
Yes.
And you were saying that the one really important thing that Afghanistan needs now is its own army, or at least a defense that is, standing on its own feet. Can you just talk us through that a bit? And what is the possibility of it having its own army?
Imagine a day I was beaten by Taliban on the street, but today I'm chairing the Defense Committee in Afghan Parliament, this is 100% male job, not a female job at all. Even in modern countries, this committee is leading by men, and particularly those men they have lots of military experience. Country needs to stand on their feet, as you're asking India, although you are. But what I mean, we are not big population. We are only near 30 million Afghans. It's not too big. We have lots of natural resources, which is maybe in 5 years' time, we can sign lots of contracts with different companies to come and take, even share contract. We have the country which is 70% our economy is related to the agriculture. And people are having a normal life. You can see more poor on the big cities, but you cannot see the poor on the villages. This is the difference between Afghanistan and other countries. But standing on their feet, being independent and deciding by your choice and yourself the government you like to. Being independent means you will have a strategic partnership with many countries, but it shouldn't mean you're part of that countries or those countries, which is you're signing the strategic partnership. The third, being independent to choosing for yourself what you like. Who's the best? You should be a decision maker, not someone else. Being independent and standing on their feet to keep your soil, your territory safe and defenses from your enemy under any name. For me, foreign is foreign. For me, non-Afghan is non-Afghan. For me, if even Afghan was standing and doing suicide, I'm against, because they are coming and killing Afghan. If the US bombing on ordinary people in the villages, I'm against, because they're Afghan. I'm here to say that we won't save Afghan life for better Afghanistan. And that means countries standing on their own feet, economically, politically, geographically.
Just one more detail about Shukriya, that when she stood for election, she stood in the same constituency as her husband, who had millions of, well, I'm saying rupees to spend, whereas Shukriya did a campaign on street corners. You know, she was a street fighter, whereas he came backed with money, and Shukriya won the election. And Shukriya, while I'm turning you into Bono number 2, she's also going to stand for Afghanistan presidentship in 2014.
Inshallah. Thank you. But allow me one sentence. I like to be Afghan-made politician, not the Washington-made, not the Moscow-made, not the Islamabad-made, not the Tehran-made, just pure Afghan-made leader for lovely country Afghanistan.
And so, Chris, to Hillary Clinton.
You know, when Hillary Clinton talks about, in effect, good terrorists and bad terrorists, it shows how desperate American policy is. Because basically what she's saying is, okay, here's all these people we've been fighting against, and the pattern is always the same. It was the same in Iraq, it's the same in Afghanistan. We go in, we occupy the country, then people fight against us because they want to get us out of the country, and we say they're terrorists. Then, while they're fighting against us, and we have people that we're sponsoring and who are working with us, some of them are getting killed by these terrorists too. But at the end of the day, we discover that all those terrorists are the people who very often have the respect of the people. Why? Because they're fighting for the independence of their country. So it's extremely frustrating for the Americans to then decide they have to talk to those people, because they're the only way to get out is to say, is it okay if we leave? And so then they start to do what Hillary Clinton's done. They start to parse them and say, well, yes, there are good Taliban and bad Taliban, good terrorists, bad terrorists. We can talk to these, but not if they've killed any Americans. Well, if they haven't killed any Americans, how much credibility do they have? So that just becomes a terrible trap. And we are about to get out, finally get out of Iraq, maybe. And the way we did that was to talk to the people who'd been killing us in Anbar province for a long time and figure out a way to work with them and figure out if we had any common enemies and figure out if they would permit us to leave. And eventually they did.
Allow me to say that the terrorists are not fighting for freedom. We have to do not make confusion between those whom they are fighting for a country to be standing on their feet on a proper way, in a very democratic, non-violence way. But if we mix that, I don't believe that those whom they are fighting and killing, Afghans and foreigner, they are the real Afghan fighter, which is they are fighting for freedom, for liberty. It's not at all like that. I just want to add that sentence, because terror is terrorist. They are taking life, they are not giving life. I believe they don't have values at all. And that's why for them, country, religious, power, it all means nothing. It's like they're sick people and they are enjoying to see how others are losing their life because of their activity. This is my understanding, which is you can find it in any country. And please remove the terror name from the name of Afghanistan. No, we are not.
Time is that this thing about cultural Afghanistan, you know, one imagines it's this land of forbidding men and, you know, suppressed women. When you were researching your book 100 years ago, have I got my math correct this time? 50 years off, 50 years off. What was the cultural fabric of Afghanistan at that time?
Well, what was interesting about this period is it's the beginning of the period when Afghanistan is beginning to sink from the very high cultural moment, which it has in Timurid times. If you go to Herat today, you see these amazing buildings, which are as extraordinary as the buildings in Agra or anywhere in Delhi. These extraordinary madrasas, these beautiful, amazing fort. And when Babur is writing his memoirs, he looks on Afghans as the height of high culture, refinement, and education. In Herat, you have Bizad producing the most spectacular miniatures. The elegance of the Afghan tile makers in the 15th and 16th centuries, where they were far greater than the ones in either Mughal India or in Safavid Persia. But this begins to go downhill at this point. You still get remarkable, strong women. Shah Shuja's wife, Wafa Begum, is a formidable fighter. You still get the odd sort of polymath and genius. But the more that the country fragments into war, obviously the less money there is for patronage, and this is the period at which you find Afghanistan beginning to sink from the high culture it occupies in the 15th and 16th centuries down to the largely ill-educated place it is today, with this huge effort needed. When you arrive in Kabul today, the most shocking thing, certainly for me, was to find that despite these nominal figures of $80 billion or whatever has been poured into the country, there isn't tarmac on the roads, there isn't lighting on the streets. The most godforsaken hovel in the back end of Pakistan or the Jharkhand doesn't compare to your average, and even the drive in from Kabul airport, it's a mess, and this money has just disappeared into the pockets of security firms and contractors. But the one sign of hope you see is every morning at 8 o'clock in the morning, the children going to school, and the girls going to school, and the girls with the white headscarves on there, and these great, the roads are full of them, and this was not there before. And this is, in a sense, the great hope for the future. Amid all the other very gloomy signs, this is the most promising and optimistic sign there is.
The bell is rung. It's time to leave. I'm just going to ask you this one question. We said, can democracy be airdropped? And, does Afghanistan want anything to be airdropped onto them?
No. Democracy is a process that nations should choose, make, and help to be implemented and exist. It's not a product that you should take it from somewhere to otherwhere.
We had first called this session Women in Search of Democracy. There was another lady from Egypt, Amina Khairat, who was supposed to join us. But let's dedicate this session to the power of women, Shukriya Barakzai. Thank you for listening.